Pyramids on the Nile. Sphinx Bro. So, science and technology was quite developed in ancient Egypt. They invented a 365-day calendar. There was a system of numbers that resembled geometry. And medicine was very advanced. I mean, they were one of the earliest civilizations to have what we'd call modern-day surgery. Obviously nothing like surgery today with anesthesia and whatnot, but they had various tools, and part of this was because they knew the human anatomy very well, because they had to open up human beings whenever they would bury them inside pyramids, inside those tombs. Now, the history of Egypt, especially its earlier history, is just a repetition of it basically falling apart and then rebuilding. So in the early kingdoms, there's problems with droughts, flooding, some inner turmoil, and this continues on until Egypt is reunified by leaders from Thebes, which start the Middle Kingdom. In the Middle Kingdom, the greatest success the Egyptians see is the defeat of the Nubians, which would be modern-day northern Sudan and Egypt, and they expand their territory a bit more. Now, in 1630 BC, we see invaders come back, this time the Hyksos, and they invade what would be considered Egypt for a good almost a century. And it's not until Theban kings launch a campaign against them that they're able to start the third kingdom, so the new kingdom of Egypt. So the new kingdom goes on for about 50 years, but eventually it falls and foreign powers come in and take over. And by 730 BC, Nubians have completely conquered all of what would be considered former Egypt. This was called the Kush Empire. Following the Nubians, just a few hundred years later, another empire comes in, the Assyrians, and they conquer what would be considered modern-day Egypt. Now, following the Assyrians and the Nubians, there is a brief period of when Persians and Greeks are in the area. This is an interesting period for Egypt because even though in name it's Egypt, the family in charge is Ptolemy, and they were greatly influenced by the Greeks and the Macedonians, so it's hard to say that they really were quote-unquote Egyptian in any way. What's interesting about Ptolemy and this time period is that for about 300 years they did call themselves pharaohs, but as I mentioned earlier, they weren't really the same type of community, the same type of religion was followed in comparison to the new middle or old kingdom. Now, this time period comes to an end at 30 BC when Rome officially usurps, so takes over what would be Egypt, and it just becomes part of Roman territory. Now, two figures very quickly that you should know. The first is King Tut, or Tutankhamen. So, King Tut was discovered just about 100 years ago, and what made his discovery very important is how well preserved his body was. His body was so well preserved, it helped archaeologists, it helped historians look inside his tomb and figure out more in regards to how Egyptians would how they would bury their leaders. So yeah, it's kind of a sad fact, but the fact of the matter is perhaps the greatest accomplishment by King Tut was the fact that he was found in 1922, because as a leader he died young and he didn't really accomplish much as a pharaoh. The other figure did accomplish a lot as a pharaoh, Hatshepsut, the longest reigning female pharaoh. During her time, Egypt went on various expeditions and gained various types of natural resources like gold. During her time, Egypt was very prosperous. They built numerous temples, and it was very interesting how she became a pharaoh was because her husband passed away and she decided to take over after her husband. And she ended up being perhaps one of the most successful pharaohs, and definitely the most successful female pharaoh in Egyptian history. With you guys a little game. You'll have time in class to actually go through the whole ordeal. It's a game by University of Chicago which lets you go through the process of mummification. It's very interesting. It's very interactive. You can see how early on it's all about removing the insides of the person. I'm doing a very poor job at this, aren't I? There we go. And what's very interesting is, and this is in the textbook as well, is canopic jars. So these items were used to store
the liver, stomach, lungs, and intestines of the mummy. In later times, the jars were made in the form of the 4 gods who protected these organs.
So you had different jars for different parts of the body, and what you would do is you would basically cut the person apart, take out different pieces of their body, and make sure they're in these jars. So I'm going to stop there. You'll have time in class to go through it yourself. It's a very fun, interactive game. The other game I wanted to share with you is the Pyramid Builder. So this game, as the name says, you build your own pyramid. So it's a pretty fun activity because you can fail depending on what type of items you use. So here we're just going to play the first minute or so you get an introduction. So here are the different gods. And we're going to build our territory, I guess, in Lower Egypt. We'll pick a site, so you can choose any of these. So I'll choose the desert. And then you can choose an angle. So you can decide what angle the pyramid should be. You choose different building materials and so on. So it's a fun little interactive activity. Again, like the mummy activity, you'll have class time to play around with this little game. Alright, that finishes up the Egyptian part. Have an excellent day. Goodbye.